Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Laura.
I'm Kate.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking. Today we're sitting down to discuss Mrs. Death, Mrs. Death by Selena Godden, one of the UK's leading performance poets. This unusual first novel tells the story of Wolf, a young writer who discovers death is a woman, and so begins to write her memoir.
The book has been described as a rhythmic and powerful poetic meditation on death, life and love, and the hidden mysteries of the universe. But what did Laura's book club think of it? We're joined by Gary Wigglesworth, a long-time bookseller who currently works in educational publishing. He's a friend of the pod and he's author of the Book Lovers Quiz Book. Gary, it's so nice to have you back.
It's lovely to be here. Thank you very much. Thank you for asking me to come back and talk about this very interesting book.
It wasn't so very long ago that you were putting Laura and me through our paces with our Christmas special literary quiz. And then we were in deepest lockdown. But now restrictions have eased and people are allowed to meet up outside again. Have you managed to get back to any live quizzes?
No, not yet. I think we're probably a little way off that yet, having to have groups of people in a room inside in the pub, hopefully in the Betsy. But hopefully maybe in the next few months, you never know. But it's nice to be able to walk into bookshops again.
Yes, isn't that great? Listeners, that's the Betsy Trotwood pub, which is Gary's quiz home. I did see a really lovely tweet. Someone said that they'd got the book and they've been working through it every Saturday night. They've been doing a different quiz with friends and it just sounded so great. It sounded like they were having so much fun.
That really made my day. That was just so lovely to hear. You know, when you spend a long time writing these things, and it's just fantastic when you get that kind of feedback. And yeah, just imagine people doing your quizzes once a week, having some fun. It really bowled me over.
And I was thinking, you know, now that we've all lost our social skills and we've basically forgotten how to talk to people, this could be the perfect way of easing yourself back into contact with groups of friends. You could just say, hey, let's all get together and do one of these quizzes.
Yeah, we can all learn to communicate again through the medium of quiz.
Exactly. And there's one other thing I wanted to mention. You do a thing I really love in the quiz book, which is, I think, quite hard for you. I think it's fair to say you don't describe yourself as an artist, but you do these wonderful cryptic drawings that are the covers of books. Can you give listeners an example?
Yeah, so for example, you would have, there's a fridge and it's sat in a field and you can see a barn behind it and some animals and a tractor, and the fridge is...
I think I've got it.
The fridge is saying, there. So...
yeah, I do have it.
What do you think it is, Laura?
I think it's Cold Comfort Farm.
It is Cold Comfort Farm,
Yay!
So that's the idea. But then I have to draw a tractor and a cow and try and make them look like a tractor and a cow. You know, so I do my best.
But I was thinking, if you tried to illustrate the cover of Mrs. Death, I was thinking, how would he do that? That's so hard.
That would be difficult, because how do you draw death unless you drew it the traditional Grim Reaper scythe way, which of course Mrs. Death rails against in the book, saying the patriarchal way of viewing death is of the man with the scythe. So I wouldn't like to do the man with the scythe and try and make that into a Mrs.
It would be really tricky.
It would be very difficult.
I've got the Waterstones signed edition of this book, which is absolutely beautiful. It's got this exquisite cover. It's this gold pattern with a wolf and underneath a sort of hare.
I heard that there was a special edition for independent bookshops.
Yeah, I think it's the same, but it's the gold design on a pale background. But it's a really lovely book, and it quite cleverly, I think, solves the problem of how to illustrate this quite abstract subject.
I hear it is very lovely. I must say, in Canada, it hasn't been released, and so I've had to read it on my Kindle, which has been a shame. I think it's been a real shame, but we can get to that.
When I went into the bookshop to find it, I didn't realise, because it had been so long, you know, and I wasn't used to looking at real books, I realised I didn't actually know if it was a hardback or a paperback. And I had a little look and I couldn't see it on any of the tables. And so I asked the bookseller, and she said, oh, it's a hardback, we should have one copy. And she went to the new hardback section to try and find it, and she couldn't find it. And so then she went back to her computer and she was having another look for me, and I was looking, and then I went back and I looked on the shelf and there it was. And I just thought, she's missed it. She missed it. Like, I feel like the book itself, it's almost like, because it's true, if you look at the spine, it's just this dark gold type on this black spine. And it's almost like it wants not to be seen.
So the bookseller missed Mrs. Death, Mrs. Death.
That's right. Let's tell people about this book and how your group came to choose it, Laura.
Well, it's a bit of a mystery to me how the group came to choose it, because I had to log off when they got to choosing the book. I'm 8 hours behind the UK now, so I have my book club during my work lunch hour. And sometimes I have to dash off very punctually to take a call. And so I said, hey guys, I gotta run, choose a book. And Mrs. Death came out of that. So mysterious to me. And what is it about? It's very hard to describe. Well, maybe that's actually not true. I think it is very easy to describe in a short little blurb that sounds amazing. But then to actually describe the experience of reading it is, I feel, quite different. It is about Wolf, a young writer who lives in East London. And Wolf has suffered a truly awful childhood trauma. And their mother died in a fire that is described very much in line with what actually happened at Grenfell just a few years ago. And Wolf survived and feels like they were plucked out. Death missed them and has carried that trauma with them as they progress through life. They're now living in East London and they hear a voice, and it is Death. And Death, as Wolf first meets her, is an elderly black woman on the side of the street, overlooked by all. And there's a very compelling monologue, actually, that opens this interaction. The greatest trick man played was making you believe I was a man. They erased me and made you all believe that Death was male in spirit, the grim reaper in a black hood with a scythe. Remarkable that nobody questioned it, really, don't you think? For surely only she who bears it, she who gave you life, can be she who has the power to take it. The one is she. And only she who is invisible can do the work of death. And there is no human more invisible, more readily talked over, ignored, betrayed, and easy to walk past than a woman, than a poor old black woman, a homeless black beggar woman, with naughty natty hair, broken back, walking ever so slow, pushing a shopping trolley full of plastic bottles. So that's how Wolf first encounters Death, although Death will appear in a few different guises as the novel progresses.
I mark that passage too. I love that idea that Death is the woman that you overlook. When you start reading the book and you're just trying to find your feet, I certainly was. What am I reading? Because it starts in almost quite a confrontational way as well. It starts with a disclaimer from the author, and she goes through a list of things that the book isn't about. I actually have a little excerpt of her reading that.
This book does not mention every person that has ever died. If you wish this book to have mentioned another death, we can only apologise now in advance for not knowing which death or dead celebrity you wanted mentioned and celebrated in this book at time of writing and printing. At time of writing, this book mourns for Prince, David Bowie, Leonard Cohen, Toni Morrison, and Aretha Franklin. And this book sincerely hopes there aren't any more inspirational human beings, bold souls, brave hearts, and superheroes to add to that dead list before we go to print. Amen. This book contains traces of ghosts. This book may contain bones and other human remains. This book has been haunting me. This book may haunt you. This book is about you and me and all of us. We will use the term human or human being to mean people who identify as human, that is, being alive and living, and furthermore discuss how they are now dead, and use the word dead to mean that the heart stopped beating and the brain ceased functioning, and they are not breathing anymore. This work does not contain zombies, but has no prejudices against those that choose to be living dead. This book knows loss and feels your pain. This book shares your fears and anxieties. This book will explore the worst-case scenarios. This book is afraid of death, but not afraid to speak about it. This book is in mourning and trying to understand this process of grieving. This book sends you all its love. This book says it's all right to cry on its shoulder.
So a bit of a travesty, which is that because I was reading it on Kindle, they skipped the disclaimer. And I didn't know about the disclaimer until I had my book club. You know how that happens sometimes? There can be like a prologue or an introduction, but if Kindle doesn't like tag it as the beginning of the book, you're just taken to page 1. And so I had missed that entirely.
Oh, wow. And I think one of the really interesting things about this book is the things that aren't in the book. You know, like the disclaimer at the beginning, like the acknowledgements at the end. It's stuff that's actually outside what you think of as the conventional story that I found almost the most interesting. But I just wanted to say, I thought it was really nice to hear Selena Godden speaking there. You know, she is a poet. she's used to speaking her work out loud. And there's a kind of rhythm and a cadence to the way that she speaks. And I think that really comes across quite strongly in the writing. It has a kind of choppiness to it, I found, that for me, I found really unsettling and really hard to get used to. How about you, Gary? How did you get on with it?
I think from the first line, you know you're not in the normal world of fiction, and it carries on in that way. I thought it was really refreshing, not like anything else I've ever read. And yeah, you can definitely tell that a poet has written this book. The way she plays with words, the way they tumble and fall and crash into each other and bounce back again, not even looking at the way that there's some songs and some poems and some tone poems and some prose, even in just what you would consider maybe as standard prose, it isn't. The way it sort of trickles down. The one thing I would say is I think it's the kind of book you decide in the first few pages whether you're going to go with it or not. And I decided to go with it, and I'm really glad I did. But I can imagine some people might just go, this isn't for me, this is too weird, this is not what I bought into.
Maybe I should confess at this early stage then in the podcast that if I hadn't been reading it for book club, I think I would have snapped it shut and put it to one side. There were sort of various things that I really wasn't getting along with. But actually, that wasn't my experience of the whole book. And we recently did an interview on the podcast with Ella Bertud, who's a bibliotherapist, and it's her job to read a wide variety of books. And I was curious. I said, what happens when you read something you really don't like? If you know you need to read things because it might not be for you, but you might need to recommend it to someone else, how do you cope with that when that happens? And she said, and I was very struck by this, she said, I will just keep reading until I find something that I love about it. And there will be something. And I kind of had that in mind. I had such a strong reaction against this book to start with. I found it incredibly hard to read. I found it incredibly hard to pick up. I didn't like the poetry. There's a mix, isn't there, between prose and poetry, and then at one point it goes into a play script. It's formally quite interesting.
It keeps slapping you in the face.
It does, and I think that's such a good way to put it. And I felt like I was being slapped in the face. I felt like I was being confronted with something and shaken up, and I didn't want to be. I wasn't enjoying it.
And I did.
I was like, why would anyone write this book? It's so depressing. Because it is basically about death. It's about death, and it's about looking death squarely and in this imaginary world, literally in the face, in that death is personified, and this character Wolf talks to her.
I found it quite joyful.
Did you?
If that's possibly just me. Because the whole thing, as I say, it just slaps you in the face and slaps you in the face, and it just keeps saying, live, 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 live. Because yes, everybody dies, and yes, it can come at any time. So why aren't you living? That's what it says to me. Why aren't you living? And of course, the other thing is not just a Grenfell comparison, but also it rails against so many injustices. But I didn't find any of it depressing or like I was being beaten. I really liked all the different ways it kept coming at you.
Yeah, again, I think that's such a good way of putting it. I mean, how about you, Laura?
Well, as I say, I wasn't in the room when it was chosen, and I don't think it would have been a book I would have thrown my weight behind, but I was looking forward to reading it. And then death came a little bit too close to home in my personal life, and it was one of the first times that I actually pushed back my book club because I hadn't started the book. I had absolutely no intention of starting the book, given what was happening around me. And so we delayed like 2-3 weeks, and then we did read it. And the first 20 or so minutes of reading it, I thought, oh, this is exactly why I didn't want to read it. This is a devastating account of a child losing their mother in an avoidable, tragic fire. And then the tone shifts, and actually it becomes this sort of wild romp through historical deaths, and it gets quite sensationalist at moments. And actually, although I very much appreciated her writing style, it completely lost me because that wasn't what I was interested in.
There's a sort of 18th century prostitute who the mother
Jack
is
the
paying...
Ripper. Jack the Ripper.
Well, so it is the murderer.
But Tilly Tuppence, I think is
Tilly
her name.
Tuppence, the victim, is a girl, yes, who men paid to go and peek through little peepholes to watch her, what does it say, about her bath or something. And then, yeah, that ends up being the earliest victim of Jack the Ripper. There's another quite surprising twist she throws in. You know, when you think you know where that story's going, suddenly there's like there's a little unexpected thing she throws in there. So then you think, oh, it's going to be like this, is it? We're going to travel in time with death, and we're going to go and witness these various deaths. But it isn't that, is it? You can't even settle into that because suddenly it becomes something else.
It's slap, 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 slap.
And that slap, slap, slapping lost me, and I only read half the book.
Oh no, Laura, because this is the thing, because I did find, as Ella said, there was just a moment. To me, the bit where she got me was the bit where she started talking about time. There was just one paragraph. She says, "To grow old is a great gift. It is the best of gifts. And when you grow old really well, it's constantly nearly Christmas, constantly ticking. Listen for it. Tick, tock, tap. Tick, tock, tap. Oh, your knees and teeth. You'll miss your teeth and your knees and your hair. You'll miss your beautiful hair. And not being tired. You'll miss not always being tired. You'll miss having plenty of time. Inside you, all that time inside you. You laugh and cry and feel like you. Inside you. You are you. Inside the rooms of your head are all the times of you. You laugh like you always did. You have some of the strange dreams and visit those castles and forests. And those strange rooms you only inhabit in your dream world. That won't change. Even if you are old now, you can still always fly in your dreams. You may still have some of the same fears and doubts. You are the same, but changed, but you." And I got to that, and I don't even know, there wasn't like a conscious moment of anything shifting in my mind, but I went from feeling like I was being pummeled by this book to suddenly feeling like I wanted to sink into this book and I wanted to just let her take me wherever she wanted to take me. And it was really interesting. And then I think also the tone does shift. I think it's fair to say there's a sort of upward arc towards the end that leaves you in a better place, I think, when she finishes than you were in with this character, this wolf character, at the beginning. And I think that really helped me as well. You know, it wasn't so relentlessly downbeat as it had been in the first half.
There is some light introduced, definitely, for Wolf.
I felt at the same time like she was doing that in such a considered way, and it wasn't that was an easy out for you. She wasn't giving you this nice hopeful bit to almost let you off the hook. I felt like it's an experience you have to earn reading this book. It's not just given to you. You have to work through it. And while I sort of slightly resented it for that, at the same time I really liked that. I thought at the end I sort of put it down and I just thought, wow, you know, what a read.
That's very similar to my experience. Like I said, I think I just decided to go with it very early on. And
I feel like you're more open-minded than me, and that's stood you in good stead.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not even I don't read a lot of poetry. To be honest, I don't read any poetry. But I love music. And one of the things that helped me is that I'm a massive David Bowie fan and a massive Prince fan. So those two leaving us within the space of 3 or 4 months in 1 year, 2016, was such a blow to me, two of my favourite artists. And of course, not just to me, to millions and millions of people. And I thought it was quite clever the way she kind of pinned it on them, on choosing those two particularly. And the poem for David Bowie, Black Star, you know, with him sitting on the beach and being all serene and knowing it's coming. I was just like, oh, this is fantastic. I love this. And then the very next page is basically Wolf just saying how much he loves Prince.
Yeah.
I didn't need it because I was already in, but that kind of helped me along. I just thought, yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
The other thing that really drew me in was the grandparents. She ends up reminiscing on her grandparents. It was quite a difficult relationship. Theirs was quite an unhappy marriage. You get a sense that the grandfather was abusive, although it's never clearly spelled out. And I thought this book was particularly oblique about things. And at the beginning, when I was in my kind of resentful phase, that annoyed me. Towards the end, I liked that. I liked that you just had to work for it. You had to project a lot to figure things out, but I liked that about it. There is this sense anyway. This child who has lost her mother and her father had already died. This bereft child is then sent to live with the grandparents, and she lives there and is very unhappy and hates it. And then after, I think, 6 years, she runs away. But she's looking back on them, and the grandfather dies, and then she goes to the house and she's looking through the objects, and these objects tell stories. And I mean, it's not in any way a new idea. I think that's actually quite a familiar theme. Lots of writers explore thinking about life and death and time through objects in this way. But I just loved the way that she did it. It felt really vivid and evocative to me, the way she did it. Even though we've been given to understand that things had not been happy and things had been very difficult for her, still there was this sense of the grandmother in the garden with the roses and the pear tree, and that it wasn't about saying, oh, look, there were these lovely moments. It wasn't even as explicit as that, but you saw them through this character's eyes. And I love the way she just left them there, almost for you to find.
Yeah, it's not simple. Nothing's given to you.
I should flag if listeners are getting confused. Because Gary, you use the male pronouns for wolf. Kate is using the female pronouns.
And I was going to ask you, because I noticed you said they.
And I'm given to understand that eventually, at some point in the book, it is confirmed that Wolf uses gender-neutral pronouns.
There's a line, isn't there? She says, I'm biracial, bisexual. There's like 4. And she says, look at me, that's me. Biracial, bisexual, bigender and bipolar. That's my labels and my boxes, that's me.
I'm not sure I even never thought about it before, to be honest. I think I just saw Wolf as this sort of crazy figure. Yeah, I guess I say he because I think of wolves as he's. I don't know why.
Isn't that interesting? So I just always assumed it was a woman.
Possibly because this novel feels quite autobiographical.
Yeah.
I wanted more Wolf when I was reading, and Gary, maybe I need to be a more patient reader and just go with the punches, but I was not alone with my book club, and maybe this is self-selection in a way. Maybe my book club is actually full of members who are similar to me, because there was such impatience with this book. No, we are similar in many ways, but there are a couple of readers in my book club who will give a lot to the author, who are exceptional readers, who are so generous and thoughtful. And I'm thinking here of Phil and Catherine, which I'm sure my other book club members would agree. Phil is often a guest, and he will always push back against my snap judgments about books. Catherine is a writer herself. She teaches creative writing, and so she's so sympathetic to a text. And no one, including Catherine and Phil, were able to connect to this book. Catherine said, I didn't know how to read it. What is the conversation? What is my entry point? Is it intended as a parable, nudging something closer to symbolism? And then she started beating herself up. She's like, I wondered, am I just not concentrating hard enough? Am I not doing my job as a reader? And she kept trying to re-enter the book from a different perspective. And her partner asked if it was like Dante's Inferno. And Joe, who's in my book club as well, and very well read, was like, well, no, because at least even in Dante's Inferno, you're given more. Like when these deaths crop up, when you encounter death, you encounter someone who has died, a lot of time is given to that moment and to that discussion. Whereas here, you know, you have the Spanish Inquisition in about a page and a half, don't you? And you don't know what the context is, you don't know who's talking, and then you're off. And then you have the Moors murders, and you have everything just coming at you. I myself struggled with the fact that they were all violent deaths. And again, I think that was maybe the mind space I was bringing to the book. Violent deaths are such a small part. Maybe not a small part, but, you know, that's not the whole story of death. So I was looking for a more comprehensive examination of what death can be and how we encounter it. Maybe if I'd kept reading, I would have got that.
Yeah, because I think, as Gary said, I think there was a kind of underlying connection. She obviously considered quite carefully the deaths that she chose to pull out and lift up. And I found, one of my frustrations was they were all so grim and just depressing. It's like, no, I was thinking about, you've ever read Watership Down? Maybe this is a horrible plot spoiler for anyone who hasn't read Watership Down. Have you read it, Gary?
I don't think so. I've seen the film.
Maybe it's not too unfair to say. The main rabbit, Hazel, the chief rabbit, he's an old rabbit. He's lived a long life. This book is a long book, and he's been through hundreds of adventures, and you've been with him every step of the way. And at the end, he's tired. And he lies down in his burrow, and Frith, who's the rabbit god, comes, and he doesn't realise because he's old. He thinks it's just another rabbit from the warren. And he says, do you want something? And he says, yes, I want you to come with me. You can leave the other rabbits now. They're going to be fine. And he notices his shining ears, and off they go together. And if you've seen the film, it's all lovely. They disappear into the mist, and in the book, you'll be completely in tears. But that's a good death. That's the kind of death I want. I want to have the happy death.
You want that?
After a long, long life, I'm very tired, and some kind person just takes me by the hand and says, okay, off you come. Off you come with me.
I wondered where that story was going.
To sing you out.
That's exactly. But in a way, I felt Selena Godden was brave because she's unafraid of really examining the fact that most deaths aren't like that.
No, most deaths are like that. Well, most people die in the developed world. They die in a hospital. No, not necessarily peacefully, but they die in hospitals, right? We need some stats.
The Bowie moment is a moment of calm. Did you get to the Bowie poem, Laura?
No, which is why I'm not allowed to come up with too many judgments. Bad reader.
Shall I read it?
Yeah, do.
Ooh, yeah.
So it's called Mrs. Death Black Star, which obviously was the name of his last album. I found David sitting on the seafront. He was perfectly calm. It was the perfect day for it. It's time, I began to say, but he was already seated, It was as though it was his idea. Some people come as if it is their will, elegant, measured, as though they know it is just a ride. David sat in my carriage of hawthorn, the morning sea in the distance, shimmering silver, as blue as January. As the carriage jolted and rocked, he blew a kiss to the horizon, as if he knew it was his time. My horses galloped along the sand, and David sang about the hawthorn. The hawthorn isn't in blossom yet, the hawthorn isn't in bloom. It was as if he knew he wouldn't see another spring. It was as if he knew living was all a dream, and not many people do.
I loved that bit when I got to it. Didn't know that much about Bowie, so it wasn't as resonant for me as it would have been to you, but I just loved it as a piece of writing. I thought it was beautiful. And it is in contrast to a lot of what else you've read.
It is very, very much so, yeah.
It just sits with you. And honestly, the more I think about this book, the more extraordinary I think it is.
Me too.
We haven't even talked about the most amazing thing about it, but which I thought, oh gosh, am I going to be able to talk about that? And I felt it was a bit of a spoiler at the very, very end, outside of the novel. There's an acknowledgement section, which, as often is the way if you've enjoyed a book, and it's actually sometimes a measure of how much I've enjoyed the book, is how interested I am in reading the acknowledgements. Sometimes it can be really fascinating to see who the author thanks and who was important to the author when they were writing something.
I always read them.
Do you? I don't always, but if I've liked a book, I will read them with as much pleasure almost as I read the book. But there's something after this. I think the best way to describe it is there's something slightly interactive about this book. And that, oh my goodness, Gary, that just...
Yeah, it's just another little twist, another little special thing about this book. And I think you're right. I think people should get to it themselves. But I have seen a couple of people actually just say, oh no, the end just destroyed me.
It destroyed me, but I felt like in a good way, you know, in a way that, again, I was happy for her to take me there. It was so meaningful by that point.
Definitely. Can I say as well, I mean, people, you know, obviously you can struggle with books. They don't have to be huge tomes or anything. You can still struggle with them. But I found it a really quick read. I mean, I'm not a fast reader, really, and I read it in 2 days, 3 days, something like that, which is quick for me.
Yeah.
And I was just picking it up all the time and flying through it. So,
well, you...
yeah.
Because I started it, realised what it was about, and thought, oh my goodness, I just can't. And I must have read like 4 other novels before I finally came back to it, because it was just like displacement reading so that I didn't have to pick up Mrs. Death. I could have got through War and Peace through avoiding reading this book.
It's so funny hearing you guys talk about your experience reading it, because it could not be more polar opposite to my book club. I had people saying, for a book about death and mental health, it left me very cold. Someone said, I have very little emotional connection. I don't get why this has become a thing.
Isn't that strange? I wish I'd
Everyone loved her writing. Everyone thought she had like the actual language. And someone said, if I read only a few of her sentences at one time, I would think they were utterly profound. And listening to us now just read out passages, it does feel like a collection of poems. And I think calling it a novel or establishing expectations that go along with novels has perhaps done it a disservice with some readers. If it was a poetry collection, you wouldn't expect coherence. One word that was leveled against it was arbitrary, that decisions made felt very arbitrary. Why feature that death and not this death? Why feature this and not that? Why take us there and not here? And I don't know, I think a collection of poetry, you are much more flexible.
Yeah, I realised I didn't finish the thought, which is that in that sense of how she cherry-picked the things that she chose to hold up, I think, as Gary said, it was that sense of railing against certain injustices, class inequalities, inequalities of wealth, race, women, and how women have been treated through history. All of these things are in there, but it's not obvious.
I think it's a little bit like saying, why has an artist chosen that colour and not this colour? It's because it's what they wanted to use to express the feelings that she's got, so she decided to use this example and not that example. And I think I absolutely agree that you shouldn't go into this book expecting a traditional novel, because it's not. Maybe there should be some kind of sticker on the front saying this book's going to blow your mind. But having said that, I think everybody should give it a try.
And I think if they do, they need to pick up that beautiful edition that both of you read from, because I knew even as I was reading it, I was like, this is doing such a disservice to this type of language where you need to pause and savor it. To be reading it on a screen is just terrible.
It wouldn't be the same.
It wasn't the same, and I take the blame for that. However, lots of my book club did have the beautiful edition and still were not convinced.
I found the best way of processing what I felt like I'd experienced after I finished it was to think of it in terms of an artwork. Contemporary art sometimes can be very confronting and it can make you feel uncomfortable and you don't understand what you're looking at. And the artist isn't explaining it. That's not their job. Yeah. They create something, you then experience it, and you come away with what you come away with. And I felt really this book made more sense to me when I thought of it in terms of a work of art than as a novel. I found that a helpful way of considering it.
Definitely. I would 100% agree with that.
And I think that's very persuasive. Hard to argue against, but also persuasive.
I'm so wondering what your book club will be thinking as they listen to this, as I trust they do, your podcast. They'll be sitting and slapping their foreheads going, what is it with Kate and Gary? Has the author paid them or what?
No, I think that you guys might be right on the money, and we're reading something that is right at the cutting edge of the literary art form, and there's discomfort and irritation with that.
I've never read anything like it before.
Mm.
Somebody said it was similar to Grief is a Thing with Feathers, Max Porter, which I've not actually read yet.
Yeah, I did think of that, and there's one point where I almost felt she referenced it. She mentioned Grief and Feathers in the same paragraph. That was a bit like, oh, because that's such a well-known work, and she's a British writer, and she absolutely would know it. And I felt like this book did that sometimes, actually. It was quite clever, the way she wove in pop culture references, and even that line that you brought out, the greatest trick death ever played. And I thought, it's The Usual Suspects.
Yeah.
I don't think she's unaware. I think she does these things quite carefully. For me, ultimately, it was an incredibly rewarding experience. It's tricky, though, isn't it? I mean, would you recommend it to someone, Gary? I feel like it's not something it's a tricky thing to say, hey, read this book about death. It's going to depress you and make you feel uncomfortable, but it's really worthwhile.
I would recommend it, but I would warn them that it's not a traditional novel. It's not possibly like anything they've ever read before. I would say that I'm a big Leonard Cohen fan, so I enjoy songs about death and dying and getting old, and hopefully they do too. It's not going to be for everybody. I wouldn't be offended if someone said to me, you said this book was good and it's a lot of rubbish. I'd say, well, each to their own. I really enjoyed it. I would recommend it. Be willing to be surprised, that's what I would say.
And I think I have to recommend it as a book club book, because my book club had a whale of a time kind of thrashing out our resentment and skepticism. And yet we only would have needed one reader who really loved it to have a different type of discussion, like the discussion we're having today, right? Where we could dig into, oh, okay, wait a second. You did find a way into this novel. Tell us more about that. So I think no matter what your reaction to the book would be, coming together to discuss it with others is going to be an enriching experience, possibly enjoyable.
Definitely. There's a lot to talk about.
It kind of fits my perfect criteria as well, because it's a book that I absolutely would never in a million years have picked up if it hadn't been for book club. No way. I wouldn't probably have been able to find it on the shelf for a start. But it was an incredibly interesting experience that really shook up my expectations in a way that I really loved. And I think she's really pushing the art form in a way that's just fascinating. And no one is going to be bland in their response to this. No one's going to go, it was okay. That's what I can't imagine happening. And I think that's what's brilliant for book club. That's what you want.
Yeah, definitely.
Inspired by Mrs. Death, here are some more recommendations for your next book club read.
Well, I'm going to head back into our archive to recommend Lincoln in the Bardo, another debut novel, this time from a very accomplished short story writer, George Saunders. And it's a ghostly story. It unfolds in a graveyard over the course of a single night. And it's about Abraham Lincoln's young son who has passed away after one of those illnesses that plagued children and adults in the 19th century. And Abraham Lincoln is grieving for his son, and he's come to the graveyard. And to him, he's alone and there's no one there. But actually, the graveyard is alive with ghosts. And there's this idea of the Bardo, which is the in-between zone, where the ghosts have not left. They have not yet departed to the other world, or indeed been dragged down. And there's this cacophony of voices and stories. I listened to the audiobook, and it was incredible. It was a fantastic book club book. It's also covered on episode 8 of the podcast. Highly recommend it.
Because it's written a bit like a play script, isn't it? So I imagine the audio would work really, really well. And when you read it, it's interesting because there's a section in Mrs. Death that's written as a play script. But when you begin, there is this sense of, what am I reading? I don't understand. Like, who are these people? And then gradually, you start to get your head around it, and the magic unfolds from there.
I think that's quite similar to Mrs. Death in as much as it's not a traditional novel, but there's still magic to it.
I wanted to recommend a book by Maggie O'Farrell called I Am, which is actually a memoir, and it's written in 13 chapters, and it details brushes with death that the author experienced throughout her life. And you would think it would be really depressing because it's just focusing, like, why focus on that, But anyone who's read any Maggie O'Farrell will know, and actually I think a lot of people now, if they don't know her other works, will have maybe discovered her through Hamnet, which won the Women's Prize. She is the most remarkable writer, and each of these stories manages to take you on a journey with her. And at the end, you're left with this sense of, I think, if someone close to you has died, actually you would experience this. There is a sense in everyday life that we're nicely insulated from death. We don't really have to think about it very much. It's not something we choose to dwell on. There's a sense it's all just a comfortable way away. And then if someone very close to you has died, you have a sense of how thin that veil is, how close we all are all the time if you choose to view it that way. It's so precarious, life. Anything could happen at any moment, and does to some people sometimes, and you're never going to know. It will be a total surprise. Those thoughts are what you're left with when you experience something like that. And it can be very disconcerting and unsettling and frightening to have those thoughts in your head. I think that's one of the things when you go through this grieving process, that's one of the things you have to sort of work through, is coming away from that sense of everything being so precarious. But what I thought she did absolutely brilliantly is she manages to hold you as a reader in that space, and you see that without necessarily having experienced it yourself. She shows it to you, but in a way that feels safe, in a way that isn't distressing or upsetting. She allows you to see it, and I thought that was extraordinary. When I put that book down, and I was riveted by it, I absolutely loved it. Hadn't even meant to read it, just picked it up idly and opened it one day. And I sort of remember sitting down on the side of the bed. I just couldn't look away. It's that kind of book. It's the most extraordinary experience. And yeah, thematically, I suppose she's interested in the same ground. And I think it's a wonderful read. Don't be put off by the subject matter. It's an extraordinary book, and it's one of those books that at the end, it leaves you with this sense of everything that's precious and wonderful about life, which often I think is what writers who choose to focus on this subject are trying to do, isn't it? They're giving you that. They're reminding you about that. Gary, what's your recommendation?
It's quite a new book. It only came out in the last few weeks, maybe about a month ago, and it's the new one by Claire Fuller. It's called Unsettled Ground. Now, Claire Fuller is one of my favourite writers. This is her fourth novel. The first one was Our Endless Numbered Days, which got a lot of attention and won some awards. And then she followed that up with Swimming Lessons and then Bitter Orange. And they've all been great. These novels have all been fantastic. They're all quite different, but she's such a wonderful writer. And the new one, Unsettled Ground, I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say because it's literally in the first 2 or 3 pages. It starts with a death. I think they're about 50 years old, 2 twins. They live with their aged mother on this farm in the middle of nowhere, just scratching by. They're sort of kind of happy, but they haven't got much to live on, but they get by, and they have a little vegetable patch and a jolly dog, and they sing songs together, the folk songs. Again, a bit like Mrs. Death, it's got this thread of music all the way through it. At the start, the mother dies, and their life unravels because of this. Suddenly they're threatened with eviction from this home they've lived in all their lives, and secrets and lies appear about their mother's life they didn't know about. I just thought she's a fantastic writer. She makes you care very deeply about what happens to these 2 twins and the dog. Did I mention the dog? Oh. Who doesn't like a good dog in literature?
A bit with a dog.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just fantastic. She's really good. And it's interesting because, like Mrs. Death all stems from that terrible tragedy for Wolf of her mother dying when she was young. And of course, that would affect you in a certain way. But then this is in a very different way because these 2 have had no experience of not having their mother around. So it's very different trauma for them. I've probably made it sound fairly grim. And yeah, to be honest, the plot and the storyline, it is quite grim, but she's one of those writers that can write about the grimmest of subjects. And you're still skipping through the book because the prose is so wonderful and you just can't wait to find out what happens.
That sounds great. And that has been shortlisted, has it not, for the Women's Prize this year?
Yes, I think it has. Well deserved.
So I think we will be reading it because we are going to do a Booker Prize style pod, I think, on the Women's Prize shortlist. So one of us will be reading it.
I thoroughly recommend it and all her books.
And I think you've got another recommendation, haven't you? Just not related so much to death, but just something that you think would be great.
For people looking for a palate cleanser.
Yeah, Another good book group one, another one I read recently, which again came out in the last few weeks. It's called A Lonely Man by Chris Power. And one of the reasons why I think it'd be quite an interesting book for a book group is that the character in the book is an author who's released a book of short stories a few years ago and now has writer's block. He has a German wife and 2 daughters, and Chris Power has a German wife and 2 daughters and wrote a book of short stories a couple of years ago, and this is his follow-up novel. So it's like, Chris Power, are you writing about yourself here? And he accidentally meets this, again, it's a book about a writer, which I always enjoy, so I'll go straight in there. And this guy seems a bit of a wild card, and he starts telling him about how he was writing the story of a Russian oligarch, but the Russian oligarch was killed. And the main character sees this as a way out of his block. So he starts to take this man's story and fictionalize it. The thing I think it'd be good for a book group is the question is that right? Is that okay? Who owns a story? Regardless of that, it becomes a very exciting thriller. He starts to publicize this story. Are they going to be after him? If this other man is even telling the truth, there's always that, is this man actually truthful or not? And again, it's just really, really good writing. You really get behind the main character and you really want him to do well, even though you might be thinking he's not doing the right thing. It'd be a good book group one, I think.
Great. I haven't heard anything about that one at all. So thanks for flagging it up. Well, Gary, it's been such a treat to have you back. It's been really lovely.
No, it's been fantastic. And I'm quite glad that we didn't all agree, including your book group, about the book. It makes it more interesting.
Always is what we love.
Yep, that's what we're all about. Some hearty disagreement.
And I will put Gary's details in the show notes so that people can come and find you. Hopefully back at the Betsy Trotwood doing live quizzes again.
Hopefully, yes. And on the 26th of May, we're going to be doing a online quiz in aid of the book trade charity. No details as yet, but hopefully by the time this comes out, if you look on my Twitter or Instagram or my website, there'll be some details. So yeah, 26th of May, a charity online book quiz.
Because the nice thing about them, I think, is that they do work quite well online. You did one on Twitter, and that was pretty much the most fun I had the entire lockdown doing that quiz. It was great.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I did. I had such a good time. It was brilliant.
So listeners, gather your book clubs together, because that seems like a fun activity to do, even online, apart but together.
Total delight to have you. Thank you. And hopefully come back again another time. That would be really nice.
Yeah.
Anytime. It's been a lot of fun.
That's all for this episode.
Our book recommendations were Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders, I Am by Maggie O'Farrell, Unsettled Ground by Claire Fuller, and A Lonely Man by Chris Power. And we also mentioned in passing, Grief is the Thing with Feathers by Max Porter. For more on Gary and his Book Lovers quiz book, his website is gpwigglesworth.co.uk, and you can find him on Twitter and Instagram at gpwigglesworth.
On our next book club show, we'll be discussing The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. With his latest novel, Clara and the Sun, just out, Ishiguro is back in the spotlight, and Kate's book club decided it was high time they read this modern classic. But what did they make of it? Did it live up to expectations? Listen in to find out.
In the meantime, don't miss our latest bookshelf episode and find out what we thought of bonkbuster fantasy novel House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. Rediscover how much we love Ursula Le Guin with her Annals of the Western Shore trilogy. Learn about black hairstyling with Don't Touch My Hair by Emma Dabiri. And enjoy an Arctic sojourn with Christiane Ritter's A Woman in the Polar Night. Listen in to find out if you should add any of them to your TBR pile.
If you enjoyed the show, check out our website, thebookclubreview.co.uk. There you'll find our extensive archive of shows to browse through. You can also explore our library of book reviews and articles, and sign up to our weekly bookish newsletter. It comes out every Sunday and is always packed with reading inspiration for the week ahead.
If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or email thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what we do and want to support us, spread the word and tell your book-loving friends about our show. You can also take a moment to rate and review the show, which really helps other listeners find us.
But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.